This is James Douet. I'm an industrial heritage consultant. I'm a British researcher in conservation of industrial heritage, but I'm based in Barcelona in Spain. And I'm presenting a presentation today based around the theory and ideas in a new book I'm bringing out, which comes out at the end of January from the Liverpool University Press on steam-powered water and sewage pumping stations and their architecture. Good evening, everybody. It's good evening from where I am. It's 8:30 on a cold night in Barcelona. So the point of my presentation, and I'll be fairly brief, I'll try not to speak too quickly, which is a fault I have, so it's clear, but I'd like to run through the presentation, then hopefully the time for any comments and so forth afterwards. So the idea is that I did a book the last 2 or 3 years, facilitated and hampered by lockdown. The original plan was to visit all these sites or revisit them, but of course that wasn't possible. There was plenty of time for writing, as I'm sure many of us have also found. So the general argument is there was a period of about 200 years during which water and sewage pumping stations were a remarkable field of architecture. Starting in the end of the 18th century, the first steam engine being applied. As industrialization gets going, they're required to fulfill a more important social and, of course, sanitary role. Steam engines develop in tandem with the sanitary crisis, reaching sort of peak in terms of urban development in the mid-19th century. And then as sanitation improves, health improves, and so that by the early 20th century, by the 1920s and 30s, steam engines are not only becoming obsolete, but the demand for their service is becoming unimportant, and the whole typology more or less disappears into the ground as submersible electric pumps take their place. And so you've got this really interesting narrative arc from the late 18th century to the early 20th century, during which this typology develops, flowers, produces some extraordinary buildings, and then disappears. And of course, it's responding to these two things. So the whole sanitary crisis is, I think, an idea really developed by American environmental historians, people like Martin Malozzi and Joel Tarr, investigating how industrialization, as people flood into cities, destroy natural sources of water and generate massive amounts of waste, produces this huge social problem. And the response is to develop steam engines and systems of networks for supplying water and removing the waste. And the steam engine involves in parallel with that. So these are the two ideas: steam plus sanitation produced architecture. So as I say, this has been the basis of the book, which of course this is an unashamed plug for. This is one of the examples I've chosen. It's a particularly spectacular example of a steam pumping station in Birmingham, England from the 1880s. So what you've got is the sanitary crisis developing in the early 19th century, slightly later in the States, because industrialization is a little bit behind Great Britain, but we're seeing the same thing throughout 19th century cities in Europe and North America. And in parallel, the development of the beam, originally the beam engine, and then latter versions of steam engines, arriving these enormous sets of these huge triple expansion engines, which are the swan song of the whole cycle. So begin in the late 1880s. You've got steam engines, originally Newcomen engines, and then James Watt engine replacing it. So this is an engine house from that period beside the River Thames in central London. You can see a very straightforward and functional arrangement, but already in other places, much more interesting architectural forms are taking place. So this is a coeval pumping station on the banks of the Seine in Paris. You can see the architect fumbling for a suitable architectural style to combine steam engine, boilers, chimneys, and a central cistern to develop the engine. It's rather nice. In the foreground, you may see a chap who the French referred to as a walking fountain, and fontaine marchand, carrying his water. And this, of course, was the preferred form of water supply in France up until the end of the 19th century, when there was a real resistance to commercialized, commodified water supply, which hampered the development of a water industry, as you see in Britain. And at the same time, in the United States, the problems of water supply and also of fire lead the Philadelphia Water Committee to commission Benjamin Henry Latrobe when he's not building the White House, and he builds an extraordinary steam pumping engine in this Grecian style. I'll just flick back to show the The layout, it's a classic separate condenser Watt type steam engine, most of it made of wood, because of course American engineering is somewhat behind British engineering, even though Latrobe had actually worked with John Smeaton, the legendary British engineer. So he then goes on down to New Orleans, where he builds another of these classical steam pumping engines, again stressing the architecture as a way of reassuring the communities who are receiving the water that this is a thing of great importance. And then unfortunately he dies of yellow fever. So the first example of a proper architectural style devoted to this building is in London, which is really the test bed, the laboratory for public water supply and waste removal through the first half of the 19th century. This is a row of 3 Watt type steam engine, a really beautiful, I think, architectural style. The guy who built them was working on the docks in the London dockyards, and I think he drew a lot from the massive warehouses that were being built at the time. So you can see him fumbling for a style suitable for this form of technology. You may recognize the standpipe in the background, which was there to balance the pulses produced by the engine's effect. And here, of course, is a Watt type engine, the cylinder, the separate condenser, the sump down here, the beam and the pump rods, and then water being sent out to supply to the right. So pretty soon we see a pumping station being built which drift away from this rather functional industrial style to much more polite forms of architecture, which I think reflects the importance of the service they're producing and the fact that these are not really industrial buildings, they're increasingly civic buildings, which we can compare with schools, libraries, town halls, such as their importance to the society of the time. This is a really interesting site. Any of you came to the Tiki conference in 2000 would have come here. There's 4 original working engines in here. So this rather domestic building had 4 large beam engines working away. At the same time, you see more architectural efforts. This is in Perth in Scotland, not far from where Mark was speaking. Again, the architect, in fact, is academic, using polite architectural forms to disguise or to promote his building. This wonderful chimney as a Doric column. And the other interesting thing about this building is that the water system, the building to the left, is one of the earliest cast iron facades, predating the work of Bogardus in New York. This is a building from mid-1830s. So by the 1850s, we're seeing the style of architecture which becomes closely associated with Waterworks, which is the Italianate style. So the water companies in London being forced to move further and further upstream, away from the heavily polluted tidal reaches of the Thames, and build this pumping station out at Hampton. And you can see the Waterworks style as it's familiar. This is in Lyon in France. This is in Cork in Ireland. Similar sort of semicircular arched windows. This is the most extraordinary pumping station in the United States, with the standpipe in the foreground on the right. And finally, Buffalo in the early 20th century, a range of semicircular windows in this typical style. So the whole form of the Waterworks moves on from the 1880s. You're getting a horizontal pumping engines replacing beam engines. The first one built, I think, by Henry Worthington in Newark in 1830. But from 1886, Alice are building triple expansion engines in Milwaukee, their hometown. This is, in fact, a twin vertical engine built in Britain. But the triple expansion engine soon replaces and becomes the workhorse, replacing the beam engine for the last 50 years of this period. This is the wonderful pumping engine in Boston, now the museum. And you can see an architecture which reflects both the semicircular arched Waterworks style and, of course, the Richardsonian rund Bogensteel, for which the city is famous. And you can see other examples here. This is a marvelous Hackensack pumping station in New Jersey from the 1880s. This is an example of a rather what we would call Old English or Queen Anne style in London pumping station, again with a triple expansion engine, despite the rather folksy architectural style. Cincinnati, an enormous pumping station with 4 huge triple expansion engines, mostly below the ground, again in this really familiar Waterworks style, and in some ways the apogee and the swan song of the entire narrative. This is Kempton Park in London, the last and biggest, most powerful triple expansion engine. And you can see even with this rather Baroque Beaux-Arts style, the semicircular windows, referring back to this earliest design of engine house for water supply. And here, the still in steam, the extraordinary pumping station, Worthington Simpson, as it's called in Britain, still inside. So with the decline of steam engines, they're being replaced first by diesel engines, and then electric motors, and still Waterworks, even in the diesel period, are striking architectural statements. I mean, this is an amazing, amazing building, sadly demolished in York, in Great Britain, with 4 large diesel sets. And even this electric motors in a building which again honed back the Waterworks style to a minimum of hints of pilasters and the semicircular arch windows in a pumping station in Staffordshire in England. And just the last example, this is an extraordinary Ars Nouveau sewage pumping station with electric motors in Germany, just to stress how much architectural attention was placed on this building type throughout the world, even up to the very end of their life. So that's the end of my presentation. This is the book. It'll come out on the end of January, and you can get it from the web page down the bottom there in the United States. In Britain, it's from the Liverpool University Press webpage. And having said that, I'm happy to pass it back to Daniel, and with Mark, I'm sure would welcome any questions.